Hello there, this is part 4 of my pre-HD Skyward Sword deep dive series. If you'd like to see the other parts, there will be a link to the full playlist in the description. In the previous part, I talked about various game mechanics and inventory systems, so I'd recommend watching that first. Enjoy! Skyward Sword's overworld is totally different from almost every other Zelda game. Instead of an open overworld that you can freely explore, Skyward Sword's overworld is split into 3 separated regions that you travel at length: the forest, volcano, and desert. On your first visit to each region, you're following a strictly linear path through, and along the way you access new passages and shortcuts to open the area up. This makes the overworld almost dungeon-like in progression, which is a pretty cool idea, since the dungeons are many people's favorite parts of Zelda games. The linear design is also used fairly well overall to steadily introduce players to the game's new mechanics. Faron Woods is mostly used as a tutorial area. You're slowly introduced to basic enemies to help you get a hang of the sword combat, and there are a couple of very simple obstacles like a steep hill and an ivy wall to make sure you understand your movement abilities. Zelda games usually have a tutorial or a beginner area, but it's typically either very small and self-contained, like the Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time, or it's a unique experience in some way, like the Forbidden Fortress in Wind Waker. Faron Woods is an entire region, though, so it's very lengthy for what it is, and there's really nothing unique here to make it stand out. Other than the extensive tightrope walking segment, there aren't any environmental hazards, and there aren't any unique mechanics like the other regions have either. I think it was kept as simple as possible because Skyward Sword's motion controls can take a while to ease into, and it is fine enough to play through, but it's still a shame that there's nothing else to Faron Woods, since it's one of only 3 regions in the game. Eldin Volcano is a bit more in-depth to navigate by expanding on your movement abilities. There's a lot of jumping around on platforms over lava, climbing up ledges and ivy walls, and running up steep hills here. Jumping is completely automatic, and steep hills and ivy walls are annoyances, so even though it is more engaging than Faron, none of this is particularly enjoyable. However, Eldin does introduce you to bomb flowers and builds on them over the course of your first visit. There are enemies called Pyrups that hide and block your path with their fire breath, and the only way to beat them is by finding the best way to throw or roll a bomb flower into their hiding spot. This stays pretty simple, but it does escalate to a small Pyrup maze that you have to navigate with bomb bowling. You also get to play around with rolling bombs across different angled slopes and blowing up watchtowers to knock them over and use as bridges. None of it is too in-depth, since it's more of an introduction to the bomb mechanics, but this type of escalation and variation on a game mechanic is still pretty nice to see. It's something that would normally be reserved for dungeons, so it shows off one of the strengths of having a linear overworld, and Eldin is fairly enjoyable to traverse the first time through as a result. You also get the digging mitts in the volcano, but I don't have anything good to say about them. You tap A repeatedly on marked spots on the ground to dig up collectibles, but it can take upwards of 6 seconds to dig up on one spot. The digging mitts are also never used for anything interesting other than a single buried treasure hunt, so they end up just being a more time-consuming version of breaking pots or cutting grass. The first 2 areas are just sort of okay, but the Linear Desert is truly fantastic for a lot of different reasons. Lanayru introduces time shift stones, which are a really amazing game mechanic. When you strike a time shift stone, the area immediately around it rewinds in time to centuries in the past. The desert used to be filled with lush green fields and advanced technology, so the visual effects are very striking. Gameplay-wise, time shift stones can reactivate machinery like automated minecarts and conveyor belts that can help you progress, which makes them pretty exciting to use and see what they'll do next. At first, you're always looking for the next time shift stone to activate, but over time they start getting more and more puzzling. Sometimes reactivating ancient technology will also reactivate electric barriers that you can't pass, or giant pits will exist in the past that are filled in with sand in the present, so you need to start thinking critically about how a time shift stone changes the area around it to proceed. Enemies are also affected in really fun ways. Technoblins with electrified swords appear in the past, but if the time shift stone that they're near is deactivated, they immediately turn into a little pile of bones. It's really funny and creepy, but also importantly marks where they're going to reappear, so you can prepare to fight them. There are also these electric hermit crab creatures called Ampullus that are pretty intriguing. In the present, they're large, so when you beat one, its shell can be used as a platform to help you cross long stretches of dangerous sink sand. In the past, though, they turn into these little eggs that you can carry around and use to power machinery like a battery, which is just so nifty. I could go on and on about the specifics, since timeshift stones are used throughout the entire game in increasingly unique and creative ways. It's one of the most successfully fleshed out mechanics I've ever seen in a Zelda game, and the overworld design is actually a major part of that. Linear design lends itself perfectly towards the introduction and escalation of the timeshift stone mechanics, and because you spend so much time in each overworld area, these mechanics get to steadily develop across 3 different overworld visits within Lanayru. It's a shining example of how this style of overworld design can be used to great effect to benefit the gameplay. However, there are a number of issues with the overworld design. After your first trek through, each region fully opens up and you're allowed to freely explore them, but you no longer have the benefit of the focused progression of your first visit, so open exploration varies in quality by a lot across each of the 3 regions. Because Faron Woods is a tutorial area, there's nothing interesting to do here, so it offers very little on repeat visits besides the enjoyment of getting to explore an open area. This enjoyment is dampened, though, because the map is pretty frustrating to navigate. On your first visit, you open shortcuts by shoving logs off of ledges to make them climbable, and in later visits you can only traverse the forest by following your original linear path or by climbing these specific ledges, so Faron Woods never really opens up. It ends up feeling too much like a labyrinth made out of hallways. All of your sightlines are also blocked by unscalable cliffs and giant trees, so you can't see where you're going or how to get around without using the map beacons. I wouldn't call it outright bad, but I wouldn't call it very good either. Elden Volcano is by far the worst area to explore. Your first visit had the benefit of the bomb mechanics, but once you've blown everything up, all that's left is a bunch of annoying platform hopping and steep hill climbing. The map also severely suffers because it's entirely linear. Your first trip through, you start at the base of the volcano and follow a straight path up to the top, and every time you return, you're climbing the same exact long, straightforward path. There's virtually no exploration to be had here, so the volcano almost immediately becomes very boring and repetitive. Lanayru Desert, on the other hand, really thrives on repeat visits. The desert is initially divided in half by a large pit of sink sand in the middle, but once you access the first dungeon, this pit gets filled in, so most of the desert becomes fully accessible. Because the desert is so wide open, it's very easy to navigate and see exactly where you're going. You can even climb on top of the dungeon and use it as a vantage point to see the entire area. And also, unlike in the volcano, the desert's unique mechanics are always present, so it makes the active exploration a lot more engaging than the other 2 areas. Lanayru does prove that Skyward Sword's style of overworld design can work really well for map traversal, but unfortunately that doesn't mean quite as much here because there's very little to do in the overworld on repeat visits. There are no optional gameplay segments to find except for a hidden minigame in the volcano, so exploring is only for collectibles, which are severely lacking in this game. Skyward Sword has the fewest number of pieces of heart out of every 3D Zelda game, at only 24, and only 5 of these are hidden around the overworld. Instead, there are goddess cubes to find, which you have to hit with a Skyward Strike to get a reward, but they're gigantic cubes, so they're very noticeable, and they're all either sitting along the main path, directly visible but slightly out of reach, or they're just out of sight behind a wall or on a hidden ledge. Exploring just isn't rewarding because there isn't much to find, so the overworld mostly boils down to grinding for treasures to use in upgrading. Treasures would be fun to gather in a classic open overworld, but because of Skyward Sword's linear overworld design, treasures have to be found at very specific spawn points or gathered in very specific ways, or you just find too many of them. This compensation is what makes so many of the treasures really annoying to get, and since the overworld exploration in itself is unenjoyable and unrewarding, it compounds the problem. The desert would be the most fun area to gather treasures in because of the map design, but you catch tumbleweeds here, which are one of the worst treasures to grind for, and they reward you for standing in place instead of exploring. It feels like treasure hunting works against the overworld design instead of with it. Twilight Princess's overworld was massive and pretty empty, so adding treasure hunting to that style of overworld would make it a lot more enjoyable to explore. The proof is in the pudding with Breath of the Wild. Skyward Sword's linear and focused overworld not having much to do on repeat visits wouldn't be that much of a problem if you only had to visit each region once, but you have to return to each region 3 times within the main campaign, not even counting any extra visits you'll be taking for treasure hunting or side quests. Repeat visits to Faerun and Eldin offer very few new locations other than some small side areas and new dungeons, and since there's not much to discover through exploring, the game world plateaus a third of the way through. Lanayru is the only exception, since every time you return, you access more significant new locations, and it doesn't force you to retread the main area again, like Faerun and Eldin do on every repeat visit. Not only does the gameplay suffer because of the overworld design, but it also means Skyward Sword is stuck with only 3 main visual themes, which gets really repetitive, and they're also pretty lackluster. Faerun Woods is very basic, even by Zelda standards. It's a totally plain forest with a huge tree in the middle and some generic-looking ruins. Eldin is slightly more interesting, but it's still a pretty stock standard volcano map, although it does have some more uniquely designed ruins. Lanayru fares far better than the other 2 areas again, not only because of the visual flair of the timeshift stones, but also because it has several varied locations you visit besides just the desert, such as ancient power plants, mining quarries, and even an abandoned port. Lanayru got so much love and attention, which does make it a great region to play through, but the other 2 regions just don't deliver and are both sorely lacking in comparison, which leaves 2/3 of the game world feeling really underdeveloped. There is one more underlying issue with the overworld, though. Or should I say, overlying issue. The 3 areas are completely separated from each other, and the only way to travel between them is by flying through the sky. The sky is a major blemish that plagues Skyward Sword throughout its entire runtime. I've already talked about how bad the flying controls are, and the problem with the sky is it forces you to fly for 20 seconds to several minutes every time you want to change areas or progress in the story, which gets to be a pretty big hassle. There's no quick warping system, and there's no other mode of traversal. Flying is your only option. The sky itself is almost completely empty with nothing to do. There's the occasional enemy or tornado hazard while flying, but they're so easy to avoid you can basically ignore them. And besides Skyloft, there are only 5 other islands with anything on them, and 3 of them are just minigames. The Lumpy Pumpkin has a couple of side quests, and you can buy soup there, and that's it. I'll talk about the Isle of Songs later, but both the Lumpy Pumpkin and the Isle of Songs have very little to them, and could easily have been a part of Skyloft instead of separate islands. Despite the utter lack of content, the sky is massive with a lot of wasted space, and this is where the goddess cubes come in. When you hit one on the overworld with the Skyward Strike, it activates a goddess chest on a random floating island in the sky. However, these islands are completely empty except for the goddess chest, so the only point is to fly all the way to the island, open the chest, and then fly all the way back. In Wind Waker, there are treasure charts, which show you sunken treasure near the various islands on the Great Sea. Even though they're similar in concept to Goddess Cubes, they serve a bigger gameplay purpose. The treasure charts lead you like a trail of cookie crumbs to islands you may not have visited yet, and almost every island has a mini-dungeon or a new activity or a hidden secret on them, which makes it exciting to explore them. Treasure charts are a call to action as well as a reward in themselves. Skyward Sword doesn't have discoveries in the sky like this, so there is no point to goddess chests other than getting the treasure, which just makes it time-wasting filler. Flying through the sky is a really cool idea, and it's a lovely visual set piece, but it was executed so poorly. It has no depth or purpose, and just detracts from the standard gameplay, and wastes your time. The town of Skyloft, however, is honestly pretty great. It's beautifully designed and has such a pleasant charm to it. It's easily one of the most memorable towns in the series by its visual design alone. The NPCs here have a lot of personality too, so it's fun to explore and talk to everyone you meet. It's a small detail, but I do appreciate that every villager in Skyloft has a house that they live in. It makes Skyloft feel homier than many other Zelda towns. You also have quite a bit you can do here. Skyloft acts as a hub similar to Clocktown in Majora's Mask. It's sort of a base of operations that you frequently return to for story progression, NPC side quests, and to utilize the new game systems, so there's always something to do when you return. In my opinion though, Skyloft doesn't quite step up all the way. The town is very wide open, and most of the villagers are inside buildings, so Skyloft feels kind of empty. Most of the minigames and activities that would normally be in town are spread across the entire sky instead, which makes Skyloft feel even emptier, especially for a hub town. There are only 3 public buildings and the rest are all private homes. I'm not comparing Skyloft to Clocktown, because Clocktown fundamentally served a different purpose, but Majora's Mask also had several other towns in the game world on top of having a hub, while Skyloft is the only town in Skyward Sword, so it feels lacking. Even Windfall Island and Wind Waker had more NPCs in a smaller space and felt more alive. I do like Skyloft, it's very nice. I just don't think it pulls quite enough weight considering how much time you spend here. However, there is one thing that Skyloft does better than any other Zelda town. One of the best changes is that most of the stores are now located within one large bazaar at the center of town. Shopping in the bazaar is one of the best experiences in Skyward Sword, which is honestly fantastic, because you'll take advantage of most of the game's new inventory mechanics here, and the bazaar actually makes these mechanics more fun to interact with. All of the shopkeepers are positively overflowing with personality, which gives every shop such a fun and unique flavor to it. I love how all of them have these goofy little animations that make them stand out, and some of the shopkeepers will get annoyed and start berating you if you don't buy anything, which I honestly find really charming. There's also this wildly energetic and dynamic music that changes every time you approach one of the stalls, which really captures the feeling of the bazaar being a bustling marketplace. Beetle's shop is the only one not located in the bazaar, but that actually makes it even better. He's flying a rickety aircraft around Skyloft by frantically pedaling on a bike to keep it afloat, and if you board his airshop and don't buy anything, he'll maliciously eject you from a trapdoor in the floor. The shops in Skyward Sword are really funny and chaotic, and it adds so much personality to shopping, which is what really makes Skyloft work as a hub town. The bazaar is a real boost to the gameplay loop in Skyward Sword, since you benefit from returning here after every visit to the surface, and it's a wonderful breather from the restrictive overworld exploration. In the next part of this deep dive, I'll be talking about aspects of Skyward Sword's gameplay, including game progression, backtracking, and the variety in the gameplay itself. There will be a playlist in the description that I'll update once that part is completed. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you there!